China just got hit by a massive earthquake. Xi Jinping tells Biden he hasn't decided when he's going to invade Taiwan, but he's going to invade Taiwan. And the US totally caves to China over fentanyl cooperation. Will the US ever learn? Then more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored, I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Surfshark. Whenever you go online, you should be using a VPN like Surfshark to cover your tracks and protect your identity. I'll tell you more at the end. A magnitude 6.2 earthquake hit Gansu and Qinghai provinces just before midnight on Monday. And that was right during a major cold snap where temperatures fell below freezing.
Tonight, the powerful tremors set off a scramble in northwestern China. People running from homes and buildings into the frigid night.
According to state media, 134 were reported dead as of Wednesday. Almost 15,000 homes collapsed and over 207,000 were damaged. And as if that weren't bad enough, there were over 400 aftershocks. 10 of those were magnitude 3 or higher. The quakes triggered secondary disasters as well, such as mudslides and sand boils that buried houses. Yes, sand boils. You know things are bad when there are problems you've never even heard of before. Sand boils sound like a plague B-side God cooked up to use against the Egyptians. Because of the freezing temperatures, those trapped had to be rescued within hours or they would get hypothermia. State media says over 87,000 people were evacuated. Of course, all the figures are from state media, and since it's hard to get independent reporting in China, we can assume that the situation is probably far worse. The only thing shakier than the ground during this earthquake is Chinese state media's credibility. It would appear that Xi Jinping is a man who doesn't mince words. NBC reported this week that he warned Biden during the APEC summit last month that China's planning to take over Taiwan. Unfortunately, though, he didn't say when.
Look, this fits into what he has consistently said publicly, but Garrett, it lands differently when he is speaking directly to the president and against the backdrop of these tensions between the U.S. and China in the wake of that spy balloon incident. The whole purpose of this meeting was to try to bring down the temperature.
Was that the purpose of the meeting, though? Maybe for the U.S. it was, but I don't think China's all that worried about taking the temperature down. And here's how I know. Here's a Chinese Coast Guard ship shooting a water cannon at U.S. ally, the Philippines, just last week. Not exactly what you do when you're trying to lower the temperature. Unless you mean literally and there's a fire on board or something. I'm sure Xi was glad to have the chance to drive this point home in person. He knows the U.S. military is what's standing between him and a successful invasion of Taiwan. And he wants Joe Biden to think twice about defending Taiwan, which Biden has said several times he's willing to do. Xi reportedly also told Biden that the speculation he would invade in 2025 or 2027 were wrong because he hadn't decided yet, which is exactly what I would say if I were planning to invade in 2025 or 2027. And speaking of APEC, right afterwards, Biden said he felt the U.S. and China made real progress, partly because they agreed to restore military-to-military talks. But it's been over a month already, and the U.S. says the two militaries still aren't talking. U.S. officials say a significant hurdle is the fact that Chinese leader Xi Jinping has yet to appoint a new Minister of Defense to replace General Li Shangfu, who was ousted in October. Now that may sound like a reasonable excuse, but here's why it's not. It's true that China hasn't replaced ousted Defense Minister Li Shangfu, but it's also true that that hasn't stopped China's military from engaging with other countries' militaries. Here's General Zhang Youxia, the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, meeting with Putin and Russia's defense minister in early November. Here he is with Serbia's defense minister in October, and he's also reportedly met with the defense ministers of Laos and Mongolia around the same time. So this whole thing about the U.S. Defense Secretary not having a counterpart to meet with is clearly not the real reason. Yeah, the U.S. has officially been ghosted. The least China could have done was thank the U.S. for the meal and say they weren't interested and wish them luck. Some U.S. officials blame stonewalling from the Chinese side, which seems more likely. As I've said before, China loves withholding military communication. It knows the U.S. is anxious about an incident escalating and turning into a war if the two militaries can't talk. But China knows it won't start a war until it's ready. And it knows the U.S. is actively trying to avoid a war, so the chances of an escalation Beijing didn't plan are almost nil. So for now, I guess we should be happy China's going with the silent treatment instead of the violent treatment. And after the break, China's iPhone ban is expanding. Welcome back. So you know how China says there's no official ban on iPhones? Well, the non-existent ban has been spreading across government and state firms. Back in September, Bloomberg reported those bans were limited to just Beijing and Tianjin. Now, though, multiple state firms and government departments across at least 8 provinces instructed employees in the past month or two to start carrying local brands. Leave it to China to make something I've been wishing would happen for years, everybody no longer constantly staring at their iPhones, and turn into something dystopian. This isn't new, though, and it's not a total ban. There have reportedly been bans like this for years, but they weren't being taken very seriously. Then in September, the Wall Street Journal reported that iPhones and other foreign phones were actually being banned for workers at central government agencies. Shortly after that, Bloomberg reported a similar ban at state-run companies. Now it's spread even further. This also expands an order from last year that government and state firms dump foreign personal computers. Workers are being told they can't bring foreign devices to work or use them for business at all. So far, though, we haven't seen any reporting that they're being banned for personal use, which is good because then Xi Jinping's wife would be in trouble. Because as we all know, CCP officials always live by the same rules and restrictions they enforce on lowly civilians. The bans seem to be aimed at protecting national security. One of China's foreign ministry spokespeople said in September that they did notice media reports about security issues related to iPhone and that the Chinese government attaches great importance to cyber and information security. Yeah. They won't tolerate Apple possibly collecting data and spying on Chinese citizens. That's the CCP's job. At the same time, I'm sure the government doesn't mind that these bans are boosting domestic rivals. Huawei released a smartphone earlier this year that seems to be competing with Apple's iPhone 15. And it also has a laptop called the MateBook D14 that seems to be competing with Apple's MacBooks. Clearly, originality is not China's strong point. And according to a U.S. Intel report, China showed a greater willingness to influence last year's midterm elections than in previous years. Now, when it talks about influencing the election, it's not talking about things like hacking into voting machines or changing ballots. It's talking about things like sowing division online or spreading misinformation. Election influence does things like try to hurt people's confidence in the electoral process or change their minds about certain candidates. The report says that since 2020, senior Chinese leaders have given orders to increase efforts to sway U.S. public opinion, especially as it relates to U.S. foreign policy on China. Leading up to last year's midterms, it says Beijing gave its influence actors more freedom to operate. Chinese leaders specifically wanted to focus on Congress because they consider it the locus of anti-China activity. They even identified certain members of Congress who they wanted to punish for their views on China. The report says the reason China intensified its campaign last year was because it did not expect the current administration to retaliate as severely as they feared in 2020. Well, that's a pretty damning assessment of the Biden administration. Does China know something about the Biden administration that we don't? Though considering how old he is, it seems like there's a lot about the Biden administration that even Biden might not know. But I have to say, it does seem like China's figured out how to get the Biden administration to do what it wants. During testimony last week, an official with the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security said it had sacrificed sanctions over Uyghur genocide to get China's help with fentanyl. Right after Biden met with Xi at APEC last month, the U.S. removed the Institute of Forensic Science, or IFS, from the U.S. entity list. The IFS was added to the entity list in 2020 for engaging in human rights violations and abuses in Xinjiang. China has claimed that the institute is essential for controlling the fentanyl precursors that are getting into the U.S. But that's not how U.S. officials negotiating the deal saw it.
How does that delisting help track down those precursors?
I'm not sure it's as direct as that, Congressman. I think the issue here was that the listing of IFS was a consistent impediment to getting agreement from the Chinese to take specific actions to help with the fentanyl crisis.
Actually, I think the biggest impediment to China being helpful is the Chinese Communist Party. As for how effective China's cooperation has been, here's what he had to say.
The Chinese government has taken concrete actions so far, but we will continue to monitor to see what the impact is.
Or here's a suggestion. we can recognize this is part of China's chemical warfare program and actually make China pay for not cooperating. Why is it always amateur hour when it comes to US policy on China? When will they wake up and see that the CCP is a greater plague on the world than sand boils? And I got a video I want to show you, and I'm not sure I can keep getting away with it. But first, this episode is sponsored by Surfshark. When you go online, everything you do is being tracked and logged by the websites you visit and your internet service provider, and in many cases by your government. That's why no matter where you live or what you do online, you should always be keeping your internet activity private with a VPN. Surfshark has servers you can connect to in over 100 countries, more than any other VPN. That makes your connection faster and more reliable. Plus, Surfshark has top-of-the-line encryption and a no-logs policy, meaning they don't collect your browsing data. That's why Surfshark was rated Editor's Choice for the best VPN for privacy and security by PC Mag. So check out Surfshark. With just one Surfshark account, you can connect as many devices as you want. Try it out now because this month you can get the Surfshark holiday season deal. Go to surfshark.com/uncensored and get up to 6 additional months for free. That's surfshark.com/uncensored and use the code uncensored. The link is in the description. And here's that video I was talking about. I'm using gaming content to hide discussions on controversial issues that YouTube might not like. This one is about how to survive communism according to the game Fear and Hunger. Check it out. I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.